Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be recapping Day 7 of the NHL Play-Ins. All 6 remaining series played their Game 4 today, and all but one have concluded today, so we will only get a single Game 5 from these play-ins. The first game of the day was Islanders versus Panthers, and it was the Islanders who managed to finish off the Panthers by a score of 5-1. And I had said after Game 3 that even though the Panthers had played well, there were a lot of unforced errors committed by the Islanders, and so if the Panthers wanted any sort of chance in Game 4, they'd have to create their own opportunities, because it was very likely that Barry Trotz would be able to iron out those problems that the Islanders had in Game 3, and even at times in Games 1 and 2, for Game 4. And unfortunately for the Panthers, they were not really able to create much for themselves, and they ended up just looking sort of lifeless as the Islanders seemingly just steamrolled through them to this 5-1 victory. It started off with a couple of goals from Beauvillier to make it 2-0. Hoffman would cut into the lead to make it 2-1 and make it look like we might have a game on our hands, but eventually Nelson would score to make it 3-1, Barzal for 4-1, and then to top it off, Pajot for 5-1, and just completely smacking the Panthers here out of the play-in rounds. The Islanders moving on to the actual first round of the playoffs. Good news for the Islanders, they did finally get Barzal a bit involved here. He scored his first goal of the series, which was obviously quite nice to see. And just in general, the Islanders played a very, very good game here in Game 4. The only bad news is sort of the similar thing for the Calgary Flames that I gave them, is that how much were they really tested here in this play-in rounds? The Panthers did look at times pretty lifeless, and so how will the Islanders actually look coming up against this top teams? Honestly, because it's the Islanders, I suspect they'll be ready for Game 1 of the next series, but it is still something to be somewhat wary of. From the Panthers side, there are still some things to look forward to. Obviously, Huberdeau, Barkov, still pretty young players and still core for this Panthers team. Bobrovsky's contract does look pretty worrisome, certainly with how he played this season, but he could still bounce back for the Panthers and be a starting goaltender for the next few years. And the Panthers also have a lot of pretty young prospects, and the fact, of course, that they could have another one added to their roster. With how the draft lottery goes, they'll have a 1-on-8 chance to get that first overall pick. So Panthers fans, not necessarily too much to be upset with as they lose this play-in series. Next one on the day was Coyotes versus Predators. The Coyotes managed to actually win 4-3 in overtime and knock the Predators out of the play-ins, the first of a few upset victories here today, as seemingly was the theme of these play-ins. And this one started off with, once again, the Predators looking quite good at the start of the game, but even though they were pushing and pushing and pushing, they could not manage to get another goal to start off this game, just like in Game 3, and that is a huge problem, because the only game that the Predators actually ended up winning in this series was the only game they actually scored the first goal in. And so while they were pressuring early in Game 4, it would eventually end up being the Coyotes scoring the first goal of the game. That would come from Grabner. Kessel would eventually make it 2-0, but the Predators would not be knocked out so easily. They got goals from Duchesne and Arvidsson to tie it up at 2, before Osterley would make it 3-2 Coyotes. However, in the dying seconds of the third period, Philip Forsberg would be able to get the equalizer and force an overtime where it would, unfortunately for the Predators, be Brad Richardson ending it for them and advancing the Coyotes on to the next round. And so the Predators, they certainly pushed, they were certainly competitive in this series, but unfortunately for them, they end up going out in just 4 games. Now, let's take a look at the good news for the Coyotes. The good news, I would say, primarily is Darcy Kemper. He did have a tough Game 2, as I had mentioned at the time, but mostly he was quite solid in this series. Games 1, Games 2, 3, 4, he faced, or not 2, but in Games 1, 3, and 4, he faced a ton of shots. He managed to really keep the Predators off the board more often than not, and so a great series for him and other Coyotes players all throughout the lineup, from top line with Taylor Hall and Phil Kessel to the bottom lines with, of course, Brad Richardson, who ended up being the hero, and from the top defensive pairings of Ekman Larsson to the bottom defensive pairings of Osterley. The Coyotes got contributions all throughout, so it's a good thing when you can get something like that going for yourself in the playoffs. The bad news for the Coyotes is that in this series, even though they did manage to win, and it did only take 4 games, they did definitely let the Predators really sort of rail on them a lot. 40 shots in almost every single game, if I'm not mistaken. And while the Predators weren't able to capitalize fully on that, if the Coyotes end up going up against, let's say, a team like the Golden Knights or the Avalanche or the St. Louis Blues in the next round, and they just end up giving 40 shots to them, I don't know if they'll have as much of an opportunity. The Predators sort of were just the slogan for the Predators in this series were missed opportunities, and I just don't know if in the following series, if the Coyotes continue to be sort of porous defensively, whether or not the next team will also have those same missed opportunities. From the Predator side, things still looking decent for them. Yes, they did just sign Duchesne to a big contract, but he's still relatively young, and it's not necessarily the most expensive contract for a player who should be quite skilled. They still got players like Forsberg, Johansson, Arvidsson, maybe not elite players, but still certainly top 6 and likely top line materials. They still got great defensemen in Josi Ellis. Josi might actually just end up winning the Norris this season. And even though Pekka Rinne has maybe sort of gone past his expiration date in Nashville, they do have Jussi Saros, who has stepped up and looked pretty good in this series for the Nashville Predators. Got outdueled more often than not by Kemper, but still is a young goaltender and will likely be the starter for the Predators in the future. And of course, as I mentioned, with every team eliminated, a 1 on 8 chance of getting Alexis Lafreniere in the draft lottery. The next game of the day was Canadiens versus Penguins, and this was probably the most disappointing game of the day because the Penguins came in, they were down 2-1 in this series, and it was pretty unfortunate for themselves because it likely felt as though they played well enough to get these victories. They blew the lead in Game 3, they were quite good in Game 1, and those were both losses, and yet coming into Game 4, the Penguins put up their worst performance of the entire series, just a completely uninspired performance from every single Penguin up and down the lineup, I guess, except Tristan Jarry, who ended up getting the start over Matt Murray, and they ended up getting shut out, having only let in a single goal on a manned net. That was from Lehkonen. Weber would eventually add an empty netter. And so, if you were to just primarily look at the box score, you'd probably think, wow, Carey Price stealing a game, really standing on his head here for the Canadiens. But honestly, Price didn't have to do much of anything in this game. The Penguins just completely awful. If I was a Penguin fan, I'd be so disappointed. And it's so strange that this is a team that 4 years ago won a Stanley Cup, and then 3 years ago won a second Stanley Cup in a row, and now all of a sudden this is the same team that last year got swept and just knocked out by the Islanders in the first round, and now all of a sudden losing in 4 games in a best of 5 series to a team that likely shouldn't have even been in the playoffs had the regular season gone as planned. And so just a disappointing finish for the Penguins. On the other hand, the Canadiens, quite impressive that they actually managed to get this victory. The good news for them is that a lot of players were huge for them, not just Carey Price, who of course was fantastic, but players like Jeff Petrie, Shea Weber were very good on the back end. Their young forwards like Kotkaniemi and Suzuki were very good at the front. And so it was a good team effort from the Canadiens to actually close off the Penguins. The only bad news, and maybe this is being a bit of a downer here, and maybe underestimating this team as well, is the fact that they now move on to the next round. They're going to face off against a team like, the Flyers or the Lightning, and it just seems so unlikely that they'll be able to pull up yet another upset. And it's probably more likely that they end up just getting eliminated in the first round, which is a problem because they will not be in the sweepstakes to get the first overall pick, and they will not have even a decent draft pick. It'll end up being in the latter half of the draft, which is okay in a draft that is seemingly supposed to be quite deep, but for a team that probably shouldn't have made the playoffs, this fact that they win this series and now find themselves pretty late in the draft compared to having the potential to get the first overall pick might be a bit of a disappointment. But of course, if the Canadiens can continue to upset these teams, maybe we'll see how far they can actually get. The next series was Blackhawks versus Oilers. The Blackhawks had the 2-1 series lead, and they would also close out the 5th seed in the Western Conference, like the Canadiens had done to the 5th seed in the Eastern Conference, with a win 3-2. And the Blackhawks, they were on their back heels for most of this game. The Oilers were heavily pushing, and yet it would be the Blackhawks who managed to come out on top quite impressively. This game started off, it was Brandon Saad getting the first goal of the game. Then it would be tied up by Archibald. Then it would be the next goal coming from Highmore to make it 2-1 Chicago before it was tied up once more by Nugent Hopkins, before finally the game winner would stand with Kubalik in the third period. And as I said, it's certainly not for lack of trying on the Oilers' side. They were heavily pushing to try and tie this game up, but it was Corey Crawford really standing on his head for the Chicago Blackhawks. Crawford had been pretty good, around average throughout this series, but he was fantastic here in this game 4 and got the victory for the Blackhawks. Good news for the Blackhawks, just like the Canadians, they were getting contributions up and down the lineup. Kubalik really showing himself to be a solid rookie player. Taves looked quite good in this series. Patrick Kane also looked pretty good. I thought Duncan Keith looked solid. Connor Murphy looked pretty good. And Crawford, even though it wasn't the fantastic first 3 games, he had a great game 4. And so Blackhawks, it was a nice series for them, certainly. But the bad news is also very similar to what the Canadians' bad news were, is that the Blackhawks were a team that probably shouldn't have made the playoffs. They were likely hoping for a pretty decent draft pick, and now with this victory, they do not have a chance at that first overall, and it's just seemingly so unlikely that they'll be able to beat one of the Golden Knights or the Blues or the Avalanche in the first round of these actual playoffs, and so it could be sort of a squandered opportunity. It's nice certainly as a Chicago Blackhawks fan. I'm sure if you asked after a game if a Blackhawks fan was happy, they'd say yes. But in the long term, was this a good thing for them? I don't know. Next game was Maple Leafs versus Blue Jackets, and this was actually the only series that did not conclude here tonight. This one will go to a Game 5 because it was the Maple Leafs getting the 4-3 overtime victory come from behind. A crazy game, certainly. In this one, it was the Blue Jackets, like the Leafs in the previous game, who managed to build up a 3-0 lead. That came slowly but surely over the course of the game from goals from Atkinson, Gavrikov, and then Boone Jenner in the last 6 or so minutes of the third period. And this one seemed over. Merzlikins was playing quite well. The Blue Jackets were playing quite well. And the Leafs looked sort of at the end of their wits. But once the goalie got pulled with about 4 minutes to go, Nylander would get the first one, Tavares would follow up very soon after, and then eventually Hyman in the dying seconds of the third period would tie it up, and we would head to an overtime, where we would see a bit of a controversial penalty called. And this one sort of reminded me of the penalty called against Barclay Goodrow back in Game 6 against the Golden Knights. In that game, it was about full first overtime, and then halfway through the second overtime where Goodrow was randomly called for a slashing penalty of all things. And while the Sharks ended up winning that game compared to the Blue Jackets, who ended up losing this game, it is quite the similar situation. In this one, there were other potential infractions that could have been called in the overtime, but the refs decided not to do so, and that's normally a good thing because unless a call is really egregious, usually fans want to see the players actually just play. And in this case, the trip didn't seem to be particularly egregious, except for the fact that Morgan Rielly ended up going down and sort of labored on the ice for a good while. And so while this penalty ended up getting whistled down and it ended up being a tripping call onto Nick Foligno, all of a sudden Rielly seemed to be pretty okay and really not at all worse for wear, and he immediately played the upcoming power play for the Leafs. He immediately made the great keep in at the blue line to keep the puck alive in the zone for the Leafs, and then just a few seconds later Matthews would end the game. So certainly feel for Blue Jackets fan in this unfortunate situation, but the fact that remains, they had a 3-0 lead in the last 4 minutes of this game, and yet they ended up going into overtime. So it's sort of their own fault that this situation with Morgan Rielly ended up actually materializing in the first place. Now, good news for the Maple Leafs. Their top players really came up big for them here right at the end, and the Maple Leafs definitely showed up in the last few minutes and into the overtime. Obviously, the big problem for them and the bad news is the fact that once again, we got the situation with the Leafs in which for most of the game, they just look completely lifeless and like it doesn't matter to them, and then for whatever reason, after just at some random point a switch is flipped and they look like one of the best teams in the NHL. It's just this strange phenomenon, and I just don't see if this were to happen again in the next game, in Game 5, a Blue Jackets lead. I just don't see them being able to blow that one again, so the Leafs really need to get on top of things going into that final Game 5. Good news for the Blue Jackets is they showed once again that they can beat up on the Maple Leafs. They can create these leads for themselves, and while it was an unfortunate situation where they end up blowing the lead. It's also sort of like a 1 in a million opportunity. And so if the Blue Jackets, as I said, if they can do it again, they probably hold it off this time. The only real bad news I have to look at is the goaltending for the Blue Jackets. They came into these playoffs with Merzlikins and Korpisalo. Decided to go with Korpisalo for game 1. It worked out game 1. It was fine in game 2, but he ended up getting pulled after sort of a mini collapse in that game, led in those 3 goals, and Merzlikins came in. Merzlikins was perfect in relief, and he was quite strong throughout most of this game, but you have to look at Merzlikins in these last few minutes and say that he really seemed to have collapsed under the pressure. This Nylander goal is one he probably should have had. The Tavares one, maybe not so much, but it's 3-2. We're coming to the dying seconds of the third period. If Merzlikins makes this save and the Blue Jackets get possession and they clear it down the ice, the game is almost certainly over and the series is won. But Merzlikins chokes this. He somehow fails to make what seemingly was quite an easy save. And this forces the overtime and eventually leads to this Matthews goal, which, of course, to be fair, he had zero chance on. But the fact that he lets in this Nylander one and then worse lets in this Hyman goal shows that he did seemingly crack under the pressure in this situation. So Tortorella is left with the opportunity, or with the question, does he go back to Korpisalo, who had his own issues, or does he go with Merzlikins once more, who showed off that maybe he's not the most reliable goaltender as we came to the last few minutes. Next and final game on the docket was Canucks versus Minnesota Wild, and this was one that the Canucks managed to finish off. It took overtime, but it was a 5-4 victory, and this was quite back and forth. It started off with a Luke Cunnin goal before Pearson would tie it up at 1, then Stahl and Eriksson Ek would make it 3-1 Wild before Sutter and Hughes would tie it up at 3. Then it would be Sturm making it 4-3 Wild before, decently late in the third period, Horvat would get the game tire, and then extremely early in the overtime, I believe with 11 or 12 seconds in, Chris Tanev would end the game and put the Wild away, giving the Canucks the series victory. So a great series victory for the Canucks. The Wild, they showed off their offensive side here in this game, and they got to Markstrom. Markstrom wasn't necessarily all that great in this game. However, the Canucks showed up. They supported the goaltender who was really there for them through these first 3 games of this series, and they put up 5 goals, which was enough to get the win. Good news for the Vancouver Canucks is that they didn't have to rely on Markstrom here. Even though it wasn't necessarily the best defensively, it was some good offense from the Canucks. Production all the way up and down the lineup, from players like Horvat, who is the captain of the team, all the way down to players like Sutter, who is sort of more of like a heart guy in the bottom 6. And for Tanev getting that overtime goal, it was just a good contribution from everyone in the Canucks lineup. The bad news, there isn't necessarily all that much bad news. It was a pretty hard-fought series for the Canucks. Do they have much of a chance moving on into the first round? Maybe, maybe not. But it was still a solid series win for them. If there's one thing I want to point out, Tyler Myers has taken a lot of penalties in this series, and that's probably something that the Canucks do not want to have continue as we move on, because giving power plays to the Minnesota Wild might not be the worst thing in the world, but giving power plays to a team like the Avalanche absolutely would be the worst thing in the world for the Canucks, so they need to get that maybe under control a bit, but otherwise it's looking pretty good for them. On the other hand, the Wild, they put up a decent fight in this series, I guess. They didn't have an even strength goal until this 4th game, and that's when they sort of really activated their offense, but maybe at the cost of their own defensive side in this situation. In terms of the future for the Minnesota Wild, things don't necessarily look the brightest compared to some of the other teams here that lost. They're somewhat of a mediocre squad. However, what this does give them the opportunity of is, of course, to get that first overall pick that I've really harped on. If they manage to get that can be a huge boost, and this would probably be one of the few teams here that have been eliminated that is truly deserving of that first overall pick, compared to teams like the Oilers and the Penguins, who realistically shouldn't have even had this opportunity of getting that. But that would do it for this recap. My predictions seemingly have just failed completely. I had the Panthers in 4 games, it ended up being the Islanders in 4 games. I had the Predators in 4 games, it ended up being the Coyotes in 4 games. I had the Penguins in 4 games, it ended up being the Canadiens in 4 games. I had the Oilers in 5 games, it ended up being the Blackhawks in 4 games. I had the Leafs in three games. This is the only one that I might actually be able to get correct, I guess, besides the Hurricanes one that was correct. Oh no, and I guess my Canucks one was correct as well, but the games will not be correct. If anything, the Maple Leafs can win in 5. And then I had the Canucks in 5 and only ended up taking 4 games. Class dismissed.